Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Luis Favela, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Sciences at the University of Central Florida. And today we're talking about his book, The Ecological Brain, Unifying the Sciences of Brain, Body, and Environment. And by the way, I'm leaving a link to our first interview in the description box down below, which to a certain extent is also relevant to the interview today. So Dr. Favela, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. I appreciate the invitation. Looking forward to it.
So, the way I would like to go through things here today is that, first of all, I would like to get into what ecological psychology and neuroscience are, because those are the two main disciplines that you explore in the book, and also the relationship between them and how they historically sort of came apart theoretically, methodologically, and so on, and then get into the framework that you bring into the book that you present there that perhaps can bring them back together and perhaps other aspects of our psychology. And so to start off with, what is ecological psychology really?
Yeah, so I think when people hear the term ecological psychology, I think if they think of anything, they think of psychology related to the environment. And so commonly when I've talked to people, they've said, oh, so you study how productive people are depending on what color their room is. So if their room is painted red, then that means the ecology causes them to be angry and agitated. And I'm like, well, maybe, but that's not what we mean here in this case. So when I say ecological psychology, I'm referring to a tradition in perceptual psychology that originates with James Gibson in the mid-20th century, around the 1950s, and also with his spouse, Eleanor Gibson, also around that same time. So ecological psychology was a bit of a reaction to the more popular or increasingly popular approaches to perception around the mid-20th century. And so around that time, you had something called the cognitive revolution. And so the cognitive revolution was pushing back against behaviorist approaches. And so behaviorism in the late 1800s, early 1900s argued that if there's anything to a mind or to being mental, really what matters for a scientific study of that is what can be observed in behavior. And so the idea was we could try and explain even the most complex behaviors by things like a reflex or stimulus response rules that an organism develops over its lifetime or even over evolutionary timescales. The cognitive revolution came along and said, well, that's kind of interesting and you can explain a lot of stuff that way, but there seems to be a lot of mental things happening that you can't explain just by looking at the environment and then the response that the organism has. And so Noam Chomsky has this famous pushback argument against behaviorism where he said, the environment is too impoverished. It's too poor with information for example, language learning. So an infant that's starting to learn language, even if it's exposed much of the day to its parents talking and family talking, that doesn't seem to be enough to account for the richness and the seemingly infinite combination of words that a human being learns how to use. And so Chomsky and others that came along later said there must be some things that are already built into the mind. And so, yeah, maybe there's stimulus in the environment and then there are responses from the organism, but those responses are going to be based on innate structures that are already in the brain. And so this launched a whole new paradigm, if you will, a whole new way of doing psychology, which said we don't have to treat the inside of the organism like a black box, right? Where you have your input, some magic happens, and then you get an output. No, we can start looking at those structures. And around that time, also what became popular was computers. So the computational devices were becoming more and more popular, and people said, wow, computers, they have these like internal rules, and they can, you give them certain kind of inputs and they get really complex outputs. And it seems like you can mix that up in almost infinite ways. And so that there was a marriage between these different approaches artificial intelligence at the time, linguistics, and some other subfields as well. And they came together and they said, well, then things like perception must also require some internal properties as well. And so you can't really explain something like detecting distance just based on the stimulus. Because, for example, if you had a little tree that was up close to you, or you had a big tree that was far away from you, if all that it requires for vision is the information in the environment, well, the little tree and the big tree on the same line would cast the same image on your retinal cells. So you wouldn't be able to tell, they would look the same size. Thus, we must have certain rules in our mind that allows us to maybe take cues from the environment. We see things that maybe the angles of shadows or something like that might tell us that something's further away than it is closer. Mm-hmm. So computers and the idea that you would represent the environment in your mind and then manipulate it computationally, this became the dominant way of doing things in the mid-20th century. Well, here comes ecological psychology. Sorry for all the history, but you kind of need to know some of that to appreciate what Gibson was doing.
And by the way, just to mention that in our first interview, we talked more extensively about computational representational approaches. So if people want to go back there and watch that bit again, because it provides even more context, I guess, to what we're talking about here. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. So Gibson said, well, he was a scientist in the Army in the U.S. military, and he was tasked with trying to help develop better training methods for pilots, because he said pilots, they were treating the environment like a Cartesian coordinate system, where it's this abstract kind of space of 3 dimensions on an axis. And so if you want to land your plane and survive, you want to think of yourself as one point in that coordinate system, and then the landing field and the plane, another part of that coordinate system, and then you try and calculate that. Well, it turns out that pilots were really bad at learning to fly that way. So he said, well, what do pilots actually do when they land successfully? He said they actually pay attention to what the environment is doing in relation to themselves. And so he picked up on the notion of optic flow as something that guides the ability of pilots to land. And he said, maybe if we train the pilots to focus on optic flow, so that's when the environment is moving in your space of vision, if we tell them focus on the optic flow of the runway, and we try and coordinate our sense of our body in relation to that optic flow, maybe people will land better. And turns out that it did. It worked out better for them to think of things in that sense instead of an abstract sense. So this is one of the early also approaches that became known as embodied cognition or embodied mind. The idea that you get your sense of body or your proprioception and your haptic senses as a way of gaining information about the world. And so what did Gibson then do from this simple lesson? He said, well, maybe the environment actually is rich with information. Maybe organisms don't represent the world in their minds as much as we think they do, if at all. Maybe what they do is they leverage things like optic flow or the ambient light in a room or things like that. And so how do we know that the little tree is up close and the big tree is further away? Well, we know that because of information in the environment like parallax. So parallax is what happens when something is up close, and if you're moving, it seems like it's moving faster. If something is far away and you're moving at the same speed, it seems like it's moving slower. So if you've been in a car or on a train and you look outside and you look down and you see the road moving really fast, but then you look in the distance and it looks like the mountains are barely moving at all, that's parallax. And that information is in the environment. It's nothing that's represented in the brain or in the mind. So Gibson launched this whole new approach to doing perceptual psychology based on the idea that the environment is not impoverished, the way Chomsky and the cognitive revolution neuroscientists said, but that we can actually use the environment to inform even complex actions. And so from there, here's the last main bit. from there, he developed the term affordances. And so I think this is a common term now outside of ecological psychology, roboticists, people in education, all sorts of different people in art design. They use the term affordance. Loosely, what it means is opportunities to do things in the world. So when I see this cup in front of me with a little painting of Nietzsche on it, it affords grasping if the features of the object and my body have a nice match, right? If the cup is too tiny for my fingers, or if it's gigantic and I can't grab it, then it does not afford grasping. And so Gibson said, it's likely that any organism that is perceiving the world, from a little ant to a grasshopper, to a dog, to a chimp, to a human, is likely perceiving opportunities to do things in the world. And those opportunities are constrained by the organism's sense of its body, so its embodiment, and then information in the environment. So that's what ecological psychology in this case boils down to, the idea of an organism environment system that can act intelligently in the world based on embodiment and environmental or ecological information.
And so that's about ecological psychology, but then how does neuroscience get into the picture of what you explore in your book? Perhaps, I mean, we have to go through some of the main historical developments here as well, to then understand why it is that psychology or ecological psychology and neuroscience theoretically, conceptually, and methodologically, at least at first sight, seem irreconcilable.
Yeah, so the historical story that I try to tell in the book is one in which you've got multiple strands of research happening, investigating mind in different ways. So there are people doing perceptual psychology, for example, there are Gibsonians, ecological psychology, cognitive psychologists, and the like. And so neuroscience, and again, this is just painting in broad strokes, right? So there's always going to be exceptions and things like that, but painting in broad strokes, neuroscience is very much what I'll call an anatomical or a physiological discipline. It was interested in what are the bodily constituents of the nervous system, right? What are nerve cells? What are neurons? What are glial cells? How do they work? How do they act? And so fast forwarding a bit, how do those anatomical units connect to things like intelligent behavior or memory or problem solving? And so as I try to tell in the book, neuroscience, especially things like perceptual neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience, things more concerned with the type of phenomena that are studied in psychology, for example, they inherited a lot of the theoretical approaches from the cognitive revolution. So the cognitive revolution sparked this approach, which we'll call cognitivism. And cognitivism was the idea that cognition, intelligent behavior, perception, memory, the control of movement, coordinated movement, right? All these things are essentially computational and representational in nature. And so as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the idea is that it's not just stimulus from the environment and response from whatever's happening in the body, and you don't need to pay attention to what's happening in the brain, right? The black box. But inside here are computations that are manipulating representations. So when I speak a language, I have representations of words and sounds. The computations organize those in certain ways that give me language comprehension, for example. So as I argue in the book, neuroscience inherited this way of thinking about organisms as these brains or neurons or nervous systems that are conducting computations and they're manipulating representations of the world. And so when you think about a computer that manipulates bits like ones and zeros, right? So whenever you write a computer program, it's made up of strings of ones and zeros, and certain kinds of ones and zeros give you a TikTok video, or one gives you music, or one gives you a game you're going to play. It's all still ones and zeros. And so the idea was that neurons which were thought of as simple firing units. So they either fire or they don't. So they set off an action potential. Maybe, theoretically speaking, neuroscientists throughout history thought maybe those spikes can be thought of as like a 1. And when it's not spiking, it's like a 0. And so taken together, these millions and millions of spiking ones and zeros are like the millions and millions of zeros and ones in a computer. And so the brain must be a kind of computational device. So neuroscience inherits this way of thinking about nervous systems as essentially a kind of wet computer, right? It's not made out of silicon like my MacBook, but it's made out of cells and blood and water and proteins and all this kinds of stuff. But essentially, it's doing the same thing as a computer. Now, where did the split come in between neuroscience and ecological psychology? Well, right from the beginning, right from the start, there's a big split. And the big split is that neuroscience inherits this view that the environment is too impoverished to provide a kind of information that can guide intelligent action, for example. Whereas the ecological psychologist says the environment is rich with information, which can guide intelligent behavior and action. And so right there from the start, you have one fundamental break that happens right there. The neuroscientist is putting their bets on the cognitivist theory, and they're saying it's going to be all about what's happening in the brain or the cognitive system. The ecological psychologist is going to say, actually, what's going to happen is it's going to be distributed throughout the body, which includes the brain, but mostly the overt kind of gross body and the environment itself. So they're coming at some of the same targets of investigation, like visual perception, for example, and they are coming from very different starting points and theoretical commitments. And so you see that at least since maybe the 1970s or so, 1980s, that this big split between these two approaches, and it would seem that they are irreconcilable. They're in some ways, as I say in the book, in some ways they are different worlds, right? For the ecological psychologist, the world is full of affordances and rich information that's real, right? For the neuroscientist, right, what's really real is what's happening in the mind, which equals the brain. And so this is just very radical ways of approaching doing the same kind of work.
And by the way, related to those theoretical/conceptual foundations that differ between ecological psychology and neuroscience, one of the things that you also explore in the book, in this case regarding neuroscience, is that you talk about two different traditions in neuroscience. And I'd like you to tell us about them and then perhaps explain why does it matter in the context of your book. So one of them is focused on biological features of neurons, that is the Hodgkin-Huxley tradition, and the other one more on abstract features of neurons, the McCulloch-Pitts tradition. So what are those traditions really about? In what ways do they differ, and why does it matter for your book specifically?
Yeah, great question. Glad you asked that. So, as I said, the earlier days of neuroscience, as I presented in the book in this very broad sketches, it's very focused on anatomy and looking at what the anatomy itself is like. And so Hodgkin and Huxley did this pioneering work in the mid-20th century, where they created some of the earlier models of single neuron activity. And so they looked at squid neurons. Squid was a great case because their neurons and their axons were so big that they could actually see them with very simple microscopes. They wouldn't need these like high-powered electron microscopes. So they could test the anatomy in a pretty broad, highly detailed way. And what they focused on was, what are the contributions of different kind of molecular activity, calcium, things like that, and what's happening when the cell is acting in a way to, say, make the tentacle move or something like that. What they found was this is a very dynamic kind of activity, right? This is a temporal activity, right? So there's time before the neuron fires, and there's buildup, and there's activity in say, the calcium channels and things like that in there. And then it hits a certain point, and then boom, you get the spike of activity, and then it kind of dissipates, and it's prepared for another spike, right? And so this was a very temporal kind of way of thinking about it. So earlier days of neuroscience, some of the biggest achievements focused on the combination of anatomy and dynamics or time. Around the same period in history, you had some other pioneering work happening by a couple of gentlemen, McCulloch and Pitts. And what they said was, let's try and think about abstractly what's happening here. So how do we reconceive the anatomy in mathematical terms? So not modeling the anatomy, not modeling the activity with mathematical tools, but thinking about what the anatomy is doing as calculating, as a kind of mathematical kind of phenomenon. So they developed the earliest mathematical models of neural activity. So the McCulloch-Pitts model, and they treated these models as simple on and off switches, right? So the neural network, as we come to talk about them today, neural network models, right? It's a collection of these ones and zeros, or these systems that are weighted, right? And it's all mathematical. And so this McCulloch-Pitts, as a quick little aside, that work was foundational to the popular kind of models that we see now, known as like large language models. So ChatGPT, all these different kinds of systems that are so popular and controversial in the news lately, these are all descendants of the McCulloch-Pitts model, which treated cognition and thinking as essentially kind of like a mathematical phenomenon. It's all about calculations. So you have these two traditions that were being practiced, and I think it's fair to say that the McCulloch-Pitts tradition, which focused on the mathematics and the computations and the abstraction away from the anatomy, that's definitely the one that has become the most popular. Again, look at the successes of neural network models like, ChatGPT and stuff like that. For the purposes of the book, though, I point out that, and this is related to another paper that I wrote called The Dynamical Renaissance in Neuroscience, is that while there has been a great popularity in the abstraction away from neurons into developing these neural networks, there's also been a refocusing as well on the dynamics and the timing of neural systems. And so what we're seeing is more and more focus on nonlinear dynamics, things like that, as being essential to nervous systems. And so it's not just about like what calculations they're producing, which don't really matter like how fast they go or how slow they go. It's just a number of steps. And you can do the steps fast, you can do the steps slow, but you get the same output. But there's been a new appreciation for this earlier work, which I call the Hodgkin-Huxley tradition, that says it's not just about the steps, but it's also about how fast they happen or how slow they happen. And so this renaissance, as I call it, and I talk about in the book, is that neuroscience is repaying attention to the dynamics of what's happening in cognitive systems, intelligence systems, and perception. I forget if you had another part of your question.
No, but I actually want to ask you a follow-up. So just to see if I understood it correctly, then this emphasis on abstract features of neurons actually is something that in more recent times has led us, or at least some people in the cognitive sciences, neuroscience, and so on, to a more dynamical systems approach to cognition, psychology, and so on. Is that correct? Or
well, so sometimes. So
okay.
If I understood the question correctly, are people who are focusing on the abstract computations of neural systems, of cognitive systems, are they now including dynamics?
Yes.
Sometimes they are, but not always necessarily, and same as vice versa. People who focus on the dynamics are not focusing on the computational properties per se. So there is some overlap, but not necessarily so. Yeah.
No, I was just trying to really understand here, and perhaps to some extent I was oversimplifying it, but I was, since you mentioned the dynamical renaissance in cognitive science and neuroscience, I was just wondering if really abstracting more from neurons, more from their biological features, not focusing too much on them, would help moving beyond these, I don't know, perhaps brain-centered approach and computational representational approach to cognition, neuroscience, and so on.
Well, it's interesting. I think there's people who have used the same evidence to make different conclusions. So some people have argued that, because nervous systems and humans and other mammals, because what really matters to intelligence and perception and memory and all this stuff is the computations in the nervous system. It doesn't really matter if it's in a mammal. It could be, in a bird. It could be in an insect. It could be in a computer. It could be, I don't know, in a ghost made out of ectoplasm or something like that. I don't know. Whereas other people have said, no. What the nervous system is doing is a special kind of computation that's specific to brains, and there's something very special about brains. Now, where the dynamics come in, that just adds another layer, right? Some people say, what's the computations and the dynamics that prove this? What's the computations and dynamics that prove that? So it's been really tough to say who's right and who's wrong in those debates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, yeah. Now that you're mentioning that, you're right. So sometimes even when there's discussion surrounding the extent to which artificial intelligence systems can be or become human-like, there's that idea that perhaps if it's just about computations, I mean, the same computations can be instantiated in silicon-based cognitive systems as they are in carbon-based cognitive systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
So, but then we were talking about ecological psychology as well, and the relationship or the lack thereof between ecological psychology and neuroscience. But then there's also ecological neuroscience. So what is it, and what's basically the theoretical background behind it?
Yeah, so ecological neuroscience is a term used loosely. There's no official kind of discipline called ecological neuroscience. But ecological neuroscience is a term used to refer to people who are attempting to try and bring together these seemingly disparate and irreconcilable approaches to understanding cognition and perception. So what they want to do is they want to see if the lessons from Gibsonian ecological psychology can be integrated with what we know about the nervous system. And so you've got work going back at least to the 1980s in which people are paying more attention. By people, I mean ecological psychologists are paying more attention to the contributions of the nervous system and brain to things like affordance perception. Now, I really need to stress a couple of things here. Okay. So one is that Gibson, James Gibson and his spouse, Eleanor Gibson, they were really pushing back against the dominant approach. And the dominant approach said, you got to look at the brain. The brain is awesome and computers are awesome. And we've got all this technology, we've got to put all this stuff together. And that's where, we're really going to be explaining things. And I think, at least strategically, the Gibsons, especially, James Gibson and his work on perception was like, we're not even going to really talk about the brain, right? We're not going to really talk about that. Like, of course, mammals, a chimpanzee has a brain. Of course, it has a nervous system. Of course, it controls movement with its nervous system and brain. But really what matters is that we need to really appreciate the role of the body and the role of the environment. And so by not talking about the brain and not emphasizing the nervous system, this led a lot of people to think that ecological psychologists didn't believe in brains, that they ignored brains, that they thought maybe that they just didn't exist. So for example, Daniel Dennett, the philosopher and cognitive scientist, he gets some quotes from some writings he did in the 80s, where he said, people like Gibson, they treat the brain as if it's a piece of wonder tissue. It's like it's magical. We don't even need to explain really how it works or that there's neurons. It doesn't. It's magical. It's a magical part of the body, and it resonates magically with affordances and things like that. Other people like Carl Pribram, also in the 1980s, he has this other great quote, and I say great because it's something special. He says, there are some ecological psychologists that acknowledge that there's a brain and nervous system, but for people like James Gibson, whether there's really that stuff on the inside or just foam rubber, it makes no difference to their theory, right? And so you've got Dennett, who thinks the Gibsonians, the ecological psychologists, are wowed by the magic of the brain, so they don't even want to touch it or talk about it. And you've got people like Pribram and other people who are like, they just think that it doesn't even matter. You could fill, you could just scoop out all my brain and fill it with rubber, and it wouldn't make any difference to my ability to perceive affordances. Right? So Gibson and the ecological psychologists had a really hard time with trying to explain things like perception without doing what everyone else was doing, which was talking about the brain and talking about computations. So I think that's really important to acknowledge that. So ecological neuroscience was this attempt to say, hey, we haven't, as ecological psychologists, really focused on the brain and specifically what the brain is doing. We don't think that it doesn't matter if it's a brain or foam rubber. Like, no, brains matter, right? Brains matter, they're important. Are they computing like a computer? Are they representing the environment in little pictures in the head? And that's how we control things like action and my ability to grab, the affordance of this cup. Is it really about computing and representing? No, it's not. But the brain is doing something. Let's see what it's doing. So ecological psychologists were interested in trying to see what is the nervous system activity that is going along with things like affordance perception. And that was some of the early kind of ecological neuroscience work. I can leave it at that for now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Sure. So I think that we've already covered lots of theoretical and historical background here. I want to get into the main thesis that you develop in your book. I guess that before that, we just need to talk a little bit about complexity science here. We've already talked about ecological psychology, neuroscience, how they relate, how they split historically, and then also ecological neuroscience and traditions in neuroscience. So perhaps that's enough about it. If you have something else to add about it, please go ahead. But getting into complexity science, I mean, we've already, again, talked a lot about it in our first interview, so I refer to it again. But what role does it play in the context of the thesis you develop in your book exactly?
Yeah. So I think historically, part of the problem with bringing together ecological psychology and neuroscience is that they just have very different ways of talking about the world. And they have different methods and different tools that they use. So my thinking was, what if we start bringing them together by applying a similar kind of investigative approach, a similar set of concepts, a similar set of methods that both ecological psychologists and neuroscientists can both agree on and use, and maybe that can be a way to bring them together. So to that end, I thought that complexity science offered those concepts and those tools that are applicable to the very little, so the neurons in the brain, to the very big, just an organism acting in the world. And so this is not anything especially unique to me, because the fact is that if you look at the ecological psychology literature and you look at the neuroscience literature, there are people who have been trying to pull little bits from complexity science because it's such a broadly applicable set of tools. So complexity science is made up of a lot of subdisciplines, but in short, it tends to include things like systems theory. So the idea from like cybernetics and things like that of the importance of feedback loops in systems. It takes a lot from nonlinear dynamical systems theory. So these tools that have been developed to capture very complicated types of temporal behaviors in systems, right? And so all these different kinds of tools have come together into complexity science to allow you to say, I'm going to study what the neuron is doing while an organism's perceiving an affordance. And I can talk about the neuron and the body and the environment in very similar ways. I can use very similar tools. And that's what the role of complexity science plays in my approach.
And so tell us then about what you call in the book the next framework, that is the NeuroEcological Nexus Theory framework. So what is it about exactly?
Yeah, so the neuroecological nexus theory is, my attempt at synthesizing really the best of ecological psychology, the best of neuroscience, and the tools and concepts from complexity science into a way in which we can understand the contributions from the nervous system to the body to the environment and back, all under one framework. So the neural part refers to the importance of the nervous system and the brain. The ecological part refers to the importance of environmental or ecological information. The nexus part refers to the idea that we have to find some way to systematically connect, right? There's kind of a flow from brains into bodies, into the environment and back. We have to understand, our task of understanding intelligent behavior in mind is to understand that nexus, that flow between those different spatial and temporal scales, and coming up with a system that makes sense, that has scientific virtues like simplicity and prediction and things like that. And so this is a theory or philosophy, if you will, about minds, but it's also supposed to be a scientific research program. And so while it has these strong theoretical and philosophical approaches, stuff from ecological psychology, complexity theory, and things like that, it also offers testable hypotheses. And so the theory is, do you want me to get into, can I explain briefly the different hypotheses?
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay, great. So as a testable kind of science of mind, science of intelligent behavior, Next offers 6 hypotheses, which I'll go over briefly. And so the first hypothesis is that the organism environment system is the privileged spatiotemporal scale of description to understand mind. So if we want to understand what mind is, and I use mind loosely, like to refer to intelligent behavior, which could include things like perception and action, but also memory and problem solving. If we want to understand that, really we have to pay attention to the real time interactions going on in the body and the environment. So the environment will always be constraining the body will always be kind of constraining the environment. So that's the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is that when it comes to the contributions of the nervous system, the most significant contributions come from the neural population dynamics. So when it comes to understanding coordinative behavior or problem solving, really the action, so to say, is coming from neural populations. So it's not in single neurons, it's not in broad regions of the brain, but it's in the connection of populations of neurons. And so that's the significant target of population. The third hypothesis is that those neural dynamics, what is really significant about them is their low dimensional activity. So there's always going to be a lot of activity going on. We'll call that high dimensional activity. But when we sift through that high dimensional activity, we will zero in on actually a much more simple structure of dynamics that are driving the behavior. So the third hypothesis is to discover, to reveal those low-dimensional dynamics in the nervous system. The fourth hypothesis is that just like the brain and the nervous system is most significantly about the low-dimensional dynamics, so too is the body. So the body, this is again hypothesis 4, the body is organized into low-dimensional synergies. And so synergies are particular organizations of the body for purposes of intelligent behavior, for purposes of, swinging a bat and hitting a ball or dribbling a football, right? The body organizes into certain synergies in order to perform those actions. And those synergies are essentially those low-dimensional kinds of coordinative aspects of the body. The fifth hypothesis is that mind, again, used very broadly, it fundamentally emerges at low-dimensional scales of these organism environment activities. So although there's a lot of neural activity happening all over the place, although the body is constantly moving, although there's a lot going on in the environment, really intelligent behavior, mind, perception, problem solving, all these things happen when all of that collapses into low-dimensional structures. And there's a coordination between the low-dimensional structures of the brain, the low-dimensional structure of the body, and the low-dimensional structure of the environment. And that's how we are best poised to understand the brain, body, and environment contribution to those activities. And so the final hypothesis is that the NeuroEcological Nexus Theory explains those low-dimensional structures in terms of a finite set of organizational principles. So there's not going to be an infinite set of rules that guide the organization of my body, but there will be a finite set of rules that guide the organization of my body, for example. So things like critical states. Criticality is one kind of rule or principle that guides a lot of different kinds of organization in the brain, body, and environment. Essentially, to kind of flesh it out a little bit, a critical state is when you have a lot of high dimensional activity that gets to a point where it is balanced between disorder and order. So it's organized enough to maintain a structure, but it's loose enough that it can adapt. And so we call that, this comes from physics, and this is another key term in complexity science, a critical state. And so I think it's likely that neural activity, the body and the environment, they reach these critical states in order to achieve mind behavior, activity, and things like that. And so as hypotheses, I think these are all empirically testable. I think they all have to be theoretically reasonable, but they can also all be wrong. If it wasn't possible for them to be wrong, it wouldn't be a science. It would just be a dogma, and that's not fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all great. And by the way, I have a question saved for later on in our conversation about the main challenges to your proposal here, and we can come back to that. But I wanted to ask you at this point specifically, when it comes to those hypotheses that you mentioned there and looking at the evidence across the different cognitive disciplines and so on, at this point in time, at least, and I hope this is not too unfair of a question to ask at this point because you're just suggesting this theory in your book, but at this point in time, how much do you think, how much support do you think they have scientifically, not only empirically, but also how accepted they would be theoretically, taking into account our current state of the art in the cognitive sciences, and how much work and what sources of evidence would we need to draw from to really demonstrate that it's potentially true or correct?
Yeah, so it is a fair question. And I think in one way, I think things are going in my favor. And they're going in my favor because I can interpret a lot of research that has been done in ecological psychology, in neuroscience, through the lens of the NeuroEcological Nexus Theory. So I can point at research on network neuroscience that looks at critical states. I can look at affordance perception that's been modeled as synergies connected to self-organization and things like that, right? So I can pull out these examples, right? And I can say, oh, so this is support for hypothesis one, this is support for this. The hard part, though, is supporting the theory as a whole, right? So the tough part is going to be running maybe an experiment that's going to hit on all those different levels, all those different scales. And that's going to be really hard. So how would I test the neuroecological nexus theory as a whole? Well, I would have to have a subject come in. I would have to record from their brain. I would have to record from their body. I would have to record the environmental information. Oh, this is just going to be a huge amount of data, right? It's going to be enormous. I mean, look at the brain, all this brain research that's been happening in the last 10 years. The Brain Initiative, the Human Brain Project, they received billions of dollars on the promise that in 10 years, they would simulate a whole brain. Well, it didn't happen, right? It didn't happen because they started finding things like, well, there's actually not just a few kinds of neurons in the brain or a few kinds of cells. It's actually probably a couple thousand different kinds of cells just in the brain alone. So we might be kind of worse off than we thought we were. It might be much more complex than we thought it was. So what we ended up seeing was a lot of these approaches, they changed their goal from we're going to simulate a whole brain to we're going to develop ways to record data and share it with each other. So that's just the first step, right? So a way to handle all this data and making sense of it is going to be a very big challenging part. And that's just the brain alone. And I want to come along and say, I want to do that and the body and the environment, right? It's going to be really hard to do, at least in one kind of straightforward, simple setup that's going to hit on all of those hypotheses. What I'm going to end up having to do is do each one individually and then build up a case and hopefully motivate that case. But again, each of the hypotheses are hypotheses and they can be proven wrong, and it would require revising or undermining the whole project. But I think there's a reasonable shot that the hypotheses will turn out to be supported because there is other work, as I point out in the book, that supports each of the hypotheses on their own. Does that address the question?
Yes, but then a follow-up to that, since you mentioned the Human Brain Project and all of that. When it comes to having a better understanding or ideally a complete understanding of how our human cognition works, how our psychology works, and of course the Human Brain Project is or was not just simply about cognition or anything like that. It was about mapping the entirety of the human brain, and so I'm not sure what kinds of claims exactly people were making about how much of our psychology we could understand through it. But let's say that your theory is correct. In comparison to something like the Human Brain Project, if people were to apply it to have a full understanding of our cognition, how much better of a prospect do you think your theory would be in comparison to just having a complete mapping of the human brain when it comes to understanding how cognition works?
Yeah, so I think here's my, as they say, my hot take. We will not be able to explain most things we find interesting about cognition and mind by just looking at what the brain is doing. The brain is, in some ways, it's the most, people describe it, in a cliche, it's the most complicated thing in the universe that we know about. But in other ways, it's not that interesting. It's just made up of cells that are the same as the cells, in my stomach or on my arm, or that used to be in my hair. it, it's just the same kind of structure of those cells. They communicate in interesting ways. The communication, we see that kind of level of communication in things like beehives and ant colonies, in cities and the internet and stuff like that. So there's nothing really in principle about it that's particularly interesting. One of my colleagues, Madhur Mangalam, he's a neuroscientist who's highly influenced by ecological psychology, and he often refers to one of his colleagues, Damien Kelty Stephen, who describes the brain as a milkshake. And he says that the brain is more like a milkshake than it is like a computer. Milkshakes are made up of fats and proteins and sugars. Brains are made up of fats and proteins and sugars. Computers are nothing like that, right? And the swishing and swirling of the activity in the blood and the oxygen and all that stuff, it's more like a milkshake, right? And so my hot take is, when it comes to understanding intelligence and memory and creativity and coordination, it's going to have to include an understanding of the body. It's going to have to include an understanding of bodies and environments. And I think that's something that Gibson was really focused on. He wasn't necessarily like anti-neuroscience, right? But he was anti privileging the brain, that the brain is just this kind of like magic. Oh, we worship the brain, right? And it's like, we've got the little, your little soul or your little homunculus sitting, controlling everything. And it's like, no, that's not happening, right? The brain is just an organ in the body that plays a role, as the heart plays a role, different things like that. I was very privileged to have the eminent neuroscientist, Gary Busacki. He's one of my heroes in neuroscience. He's really emphasized, dynamics and time and that feature of the brain. But he endorsed my book, and one thing he said was, we really need to understand the fact that the brain is just an organ. It's just an organ in the skull, and we have to understand how it's situated in the body. And there's a mutual kind of pathway between what the body does and the brain does, and it's not just about a top-down kind of control. And so I think it's not my approach, the NeuroEcological Nexus Theory. I think something along those lines is going to have to be true to explain even the most simple of cognitive or mental phenomenon. And one last little bit on my tirade, a response to your question is, we already kind of know that project is going to fail, not just practically, right? So it's not like, okay, give us $10 billion over 10 years, we'll simulate a brain. Okay, that didn't happen, so it failed. No. Even if it worked, I don't think it would have provided the kind of explanations or understanding we want, because we've already done it with simpler organisms. So we've basically already done the human brain project with little tiny organisms, the C. elegans worm, which only has about, I think it's like 307 neurons. And I mean, compare that to humans that have about, I don't know what it is, 80 billion.
86 billion, I think.
Yeah, 86 billion. That's just the neurons, right?
Yeah.
So not mentioning the connections and the supporting cells like glia and stuff like that, and astrocytes. But we already know the full mapping and all the connections of a C. elegans, and yet we can't predict its movement. We still don't have a full explanation about how it moves and coordinates its body. That's only 300 neurons, right? And we can't do it with that. My thought is, we can't do it with that because it's not just about the neurons, right? A full explanation of a C. elegans intelligent behavior is going to require, yes, the neurons, but also the body and the features of the environment. And that's going to be just as important.
Well, I guess that things are not looking good for people who have brain-centered approaches, but also not for those sort of transhumanists who would want to upload their brains to machines.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about that if you want, but I mean, my take is that that's not a real possibility. The uploading of the mind. If there is any uploading, it won't be completely you. It may be a feature of you, but that's a whole other interview. I'll have to come back in a few months and then we can talk about transhumanism.
Yeah, it was just me because I have this sort of beef with some transhumanists. So
Yeah.
don't take it too seriously. So, okay, so let me just think here. So we were talking about the next theory that you presented there, and you also explained how it integrates ecological psychology, neuroscience, and so on. So what is the ecological brain then, really?
Yeah. I think it's funny. As I was writing the book, I realized I was like already finishing the book. And I said, I don't think I've explained what I even mean by the title. And I think that happens too often. People have a really cool title and then they don't explain it. I'm not saying mine's a cool title, but I didn't explain it. So in the end, I mentioned it in the concluding chapter. What is the ecological brain?
Yeah.
Well, the ecological brain, in short, is the idea that a brain is always a part of an ecology, right? It's not this system, it's not this machine that you can understand it in isolation. It's not like I can explain, I have my phone. It's not like I have my phone and whether I'm sitting here in a nice temperature controlled room or I sit outside and it's warm, or I go into a freezer that's storing meat and other kinds of foods, but it's still operating the same way, right? The ecology doesn't matter really to my iPhone to a certain degree, right? It gets too hot and it stops working.
Mm-hmm.
But the brain is always a part of an ecology. The temperature of the body, gravity, all these things are acting on the brain. And the brain is also contributing to directing what ecology the body will be in. So if I am feeling really cold, right, and I'm sending information, across my body into my brain, and then my brain is now, getting, oh, I'm not feeling too good. My brain might send out signal that says we need to change the ecology, right? We need to be in a different environment, and those different environments are going to affect what it does, right? And I think this is kind of the point that Buzaki was saying when he endorsed my book, is that the brain is always a part of these ecologies. The brain is not this isolated kind of system. And so to understand what the brain is doing, we have to understand that it is part of that interactive kind of system. And to that, and not to beat up on the transhumanists again, but and to beat up on the Human Brain Project, but that's what's kind of missing, right? Is this lack of appreciation of what actually should just be a really simple fact, right? So in short, what is the ecological brain? The ecological brain is the claim that, like every other aspect of organisms, the brain too is situated and embedded in a certain kind of ecology. And that's going to affect its functioning and what it does.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I hope this is not a silly question, but since we're talking about ecology here, there's also an approach coming mostly from biology, but also nowadays many anthropologists apply it or use it as a framework. There is behavioral ecology, and then in the context of anthropology, human behavioral ecology, that is, people look at different aspects, different factors that differ across different ecologies, and then try to understand in terms of our behavioral outputs, our behavior, if there's regularities in terms of if people are exposed to this or that ecological factors, if there's some tendencies to develop societies with certain characteristics, or they themselves as individuals behaving in certain ways. So does it connect or has any relationship to that in any way? Because I was trying to understand if that aspect of biology could also play a role here or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely friendly. At a minimum, it's friendly to those kinds of approaches. What you're talking about as well, I think there might be some overlap with what I'm talking about, what you're talking about, and then with something called developmental systems theory.
Mm-hmm.
And so developmental systems theory is its approach to biology and psychology. It has come to influence even things like such as understand the criminal justice system and things like that. But the idea is always that it's these whole systems that undergo change and adaptation. So it's, I'm not, what you're specifically referring to, I don't want to say what I'm about to say applies to that, but this applies to what I'm saying and what the developmental systems theorists say.
Mm-hmm.
They are anti-reductionist in the sense that it's not just genes, for example, as maybe the most reductionist approach to biology. It's not just the gene that is driving, an organism's success. And it's not just the gene that is being acted on by selective pressures, but actually it's the gene, part of the organism, part of the environment. That whole system is what's being selected for. So for example, when beavers, they have a certain kind of body, they exist in certain kind of environments, they build certain kinds of dams, their teeth work on those kinds of trees and wood in that area. If those beaver families survive, it's because it's the whole system that survived. It's the fur, the tail, the teeth, the wood, the water, all of that is a developing system over time. And so it wouldn't make sense to just focus on what are the genes doing, right? Put those same genes, in a different body, or put those beavers in a different environment, and they might not be selected for, or they might be selected for. The point is that it takes this whole entire kind of system to be selected for. Is that does this fit with what this behavioral kind of and the anthropological stuff you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I guess that perhaps one of the things you were alluding to there, I'm not sure if directly or not, when you mentioned the example of the beavers, is niche construction as well, or not?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think even people who were the most, and I use scare quotes again, the most reductionist about biology, I think even they, you push them enough and they'll say it can't possibly be just the genes. So Richard Dawkins was one of the big proponents of the gene-centric approach. He also had a book called The Extended Phenotype, right? And he talks about how these behavioral things that happen in the world, the use of wood and the environment and stuff like that. He'd like to frame it in terms of extensions of the genes. I'm reading the same thing that he's saying, and I come to different conclusions. It makes me think the gene is less important, but that's up to the biologist to debate.
Sure. So I mentioned this question earlier, but what would you say are perhaps some of the main challenges to your thesis here, to your next framework?
Yeah, so there's challenges across the board, right? So conceptually, right?
Yeah.
When I say mind, what do I mean by mind? Do I also mean consciousness? Do I just mean problem solving? Do I mean perception action? Right? And these things are all debatable, right? So some people argue that perception and action is not mind, right? It's not cognition. It's something quite distinct. It's something that's more like me, again, I like using these quotes. It's more like mere reflex, right? Whereas cognition is allows you to make decisions and intervene on mere reflexes. So I've already got challenges conceptually, right? Methodologically, how do I put these things in practice? I talked about that a few minutes ago, right? If the Human Brain Project, with billions of dollars in time and thousands of scientists, couldn't come up with a full simulation of just the brain, how am I going to basically try and do an affordance simulation from brain, body, and environment? That's methodologically, that's going to be very challenging. And then theoretically, right? And this overlaps with concepts as well, but are affordances something that need to take the nervous system into account? Am I missing the whole point of what Gibson was saying This is, kind of pushback I've gotten from some ecological psychologists, right? Affordances only exist in the environment and the organism and where they meet. And if you go too low into the brain, then you're missing it. If you go too high, then you're out of the system, right? That's a theoretical issue. So I think I am open to being, attacked and criticized in those three ways. But in particular, I think I face criticisms both from people who I think would be friendly to ecological psychology, but I also face criticisms from people who are against ecological psychology. So people who are friendly might be enactivists. So enactive cognition or enactivism is a kind of popular approach to understanding what it is to be an intelligent living organism. And sometimes there's some overlap with what ecological psychologists say, but not always. And so there's that approach. Why not call my book The Enactivist Brain, right? They might want to say that, and they'd say that's better than the ecological brain. Maybe I'd have to argue with them about that, right? Then I also need to argue against people who are against ecological psychology and people who are proponents of computational, representational approaches, proponents of mechanistic approaches, proponents of reductionism, right? My book, as I say towards the end, I say something along the lines of, you might have noticed that I didn't explain anything, I didn't describe anything about my approach with computing, representing, I didn't describe any mechanisms, and I didn't reduce anything. And for some people, if you're missing out on some of these, and you're just not doing science, right? If you're not providing a mechanistic account, whatever that is, we could talk about that also. But if you're not giving a mechanistic account, then you're not giving an explanation. So I'm pushing back. It's a different way of doing science also that is pushing back against, more reductionist approaches, pushing back against mechanistic approaches, and then pushing back against, the apparent richness of the computer metaphor and of representational approaches. So I've got a line of people. They're taking their number and they're ready to come and get me.
So I have two questions, one about one specific thing that you mentioned there and a follow-up to the challenges here. So you mentioned mechanistic explanations there, and you said that many people would be dismissive of your framework if it doesn't provide them with a mechanistic explanation for whatever aspect of human cognition we're studying here, I guess. So, what is a mechanistic explanation exactly, particularly for the people who might not be familiar with this kind of terminology, and what would be, let's say in this case, a non-mechanistic explanation?
Yeah, good. So this is a very big issue in the philosophy of science. I think it's a big issue in science, in the life sciences, for practicing scientists. They should think about this. So the mechanistic approach historically goes back to Newton and Descartes, where they were thinking about, say, the solar system as a kind of machine, right? Planets that are kind of, moving around in a certain way, right? Almost like pivoting on a kind of central piece, which is the sun. And then the body. So Descartes, who's famous for his dualism, his mind-body dualism, he still was a great anatomist. And he spent a lot of his time studying the structures of the body. And he thought the body was very much like a mechanical system. So for example, if I have my hand, if I were to open up my forearm, you'd see all these like tendons. And if I were to pull one, my finger would move, right? He said, it's a machine, right? We are living machines. Fast forward a few hundred years, and the mechanistic approach in the late 90s, early 2000s in the philosophy of science, there was a group of philosophers who said, what do scientists do when they try to explain something in the life sciences? When they're trying to explain a cell or an organism or an environment or something like that? How do they explain digestion or memory or whatever? And these people said, well, what they do is they try to isolate as much as possible their target. They try to break it apart. they try to understand the contributions of the parts, and then they try to understand what they do together. And so you have a mechanism when you can say, this is the phenomenon, be it, memory, like long-term potentiation or digestion or whatever. Yeah. And here's the starting point. Here's what each of the parts do, and here's the ending point. Now you got a memory. Now you have digested food. Now you have a new baby, right? And so this is a very general sense in which you have a mechanism. The problem that the mechanists quickly realized was you can't always break things apart and give an understanding of them outside of their context, right? If you have, say, a toilet, and the toilet has, a handle, and the handle lifts the little thing on the inside, which lets the water run. And if you want to describe the mechanism of how a toilet flushes, that handle is always just a handle. That flapper is always just a flapper. The seat is always just a seat. And you just add them together. But pretty much most things actually in nature are not like that. Pretty much things always require a context, and their capacities require the situation, understanding the situation that they're in. And so this mechanistic approach had some problems and required some modification. So people started including descriptions of things as being decomposable, so coming apart, non-decomposable, so systems that only work when they are a complete whole. And then you also had descriptions of nearly decomposable systems. So systems where you could kind of maybe get an idea of what the parts are contributing, things like that. This has been the most popular way of understanding explanation in the life sciences and the philosophy of science. And I think it tracks well with what scientists, especially like neuroscientists and biologists, are doing. So what would be a non-mechanistic approach? Well, a non-mechanistic approach to explanation could be something like a mathematical description, Einstein's equations, Newton's differential equations of the solar system. These types of things are not mechanistic. They have variables in the equations that refer to real things in the world. But when you are trying to understand how those things interact, you're paying more attention to the relationship of the variables than you are as opposed to the specifics. So you're abstracting away a bit. So that's one example of a non-mechanistic approach. Yeah, that's it.
Do you think that in this particular case, if we would have a mathematical explanation, perhaps one of the reasons why maybe, I don't know, psychologists and neuroscientists, at least a big number of them, wouldn't be too fond of an approach based also on complexity theory, because, I don't know, perhaps the mathematics there is a little bit too complicated for most people. I'm not trying to claim that people from those disciplines can't learn it. It's just that perhaps they are not used to that level of mathematics. I don't know.
I think it's an excellent point. And I think, now we're psychologizing our scientists, right? We're trying to, and this might require its own kind of study, right? The nature of scientists and what they prefer. We could say, again, broadly speaking, people go into physics because they want to understand the general principles of how things are organized, right? They want to understand, entropy, of the particles in a container, but they don't really care about the specific particle. But someone might be interested in doing chemistry because they care about the specific chemical structure, or they care about biology because they care about identifying the specific cells and the organs and how those things come together. And so there might be a tension here where someone who's more, quote unquote, physics minded might say, oh, you biologists, you care about all those messy details, but what are you really telling us that's interesting? Similarly, the biologist, might be looking at the physicist and saying, all you're giving me is all this crazy math, and you haven't really told me how anything actually works, right? It's like taking a car, right? Do we want to understand how combustion works, or do we want to understand how the parts fit together? Well, I think these are different kinds of temperament. But my bet is that when it comes to understanding mind, cognition, perception, memory, all this kinds of stuff, right? That these emerge, these properties, these abilities emerge from highly complex systems, highly complicated systems with many degrees of freedom, right? And keeping track of all those is going to be really difficult. And in that sense, I think going the more kind of physics route, where you don't care about the location of every particle inside the container, but you care about general kind of patterns of behavior, I think that's going to give us more scientific virtue like manipulation, prediction, things like that. With that said, is the physics approach going to develop any medications? Is the physics approach going to help, cure cancer? I think it could contribute to it, but I think in that way, the kind of medical approach, the anatomical approach, I think that's going to benefit from having someone who's more biological, mechanistic minded, who wants to focus on the wet, sticky details, right? But as we're seeing, I think there's a co-evolution of the two to help us understand mind. It's going to take both approaches, but I lean towards, my intuition is that it leans more towards the physicsy kinds of stuff.
So let me ask you one last question then, still related to the challenges to your proposal, because I guess that one of the main things that you pointed to here is the fact that you would have to convince many different kinds of people from different disciplines, different theoretical frameworks, and so on. So do you think that perhaps one of the challenges here, and it's not only to your framework or to convincing other people that potentially your framework is correct, but also perhaps a broader question that applies to your book in general, also to perhaps understanding why it is that different disciplines, even though they might be focusing on similar objects of study, might diverge so much historically. Do you think that it has anything to do with how difficult it is to have interdisciplinarity in academia and the university context, because people are trained in specific areas, specific domains with specific theoretical approaches, methodologies, and so on. And of course, then they have their careers, and it's based on the kinds of things they have been working with, the frameworks they have been applying. And of course, it's also many times extremely difficult for people to acquire enough knowledge, enough competence about other disciplines and methodologies and frameworks. So do you think that perhaps in the context of your book in general, this is something that we need to take into account and perhaps presents a big obstacle here?
I think it's an excellent point. I wish I had asked you to ask me this question, because it is such an excellent point. The way that, the way that knowledge acquisition happens, in our systems, in our culture, is to have these kind of, siloed, disciplines. You have your department of physics, your department of chemistry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for good reason, right? Because you can only do so much. I'm kind of repeating a little bit what you're saying in agreement, right? You can only get, you get your PhD, getting one PhD is hard enough, right? And then getting good at it is a whole other level, right? And making contributions and pushing the field forward, whatever the field is, if it's literature, history, economics, physics, right? Getting good enough, because we know so much. We have so much information that we have to deal with just within one discipline alone. How are we supposed to engage with these really complicated, difficult topics like mind, cognition, intelligence? Yeah. Well, one thing is to say, the discipline that I do, that's the right discipline. And right, so I'm a neuroscientist and I care about biochemistry, and that's how you're going to do it, right? That's one way to approach it. And you say everyone else is wrong. Another way to approach it is to say, I'm a neuroscientist, I care about the biochemistry, but I know I need to talk to other people who do other things, and I need to make connections and, to see how we connect in that way, to give a more complete account, more complete explanation. But when is that supposed to happen? When does that conversation happen? Not in the journals, right? In the journals, they just publish very specific kind of issues, right? Very, very limited, right? You look at a neuroscience journal and they say, well, we are now looking at molecule X as it acts on receptor 32. And I spend my whole career, doing that. Well, what does that have to do with cognition, if anything, right? I don't know, but someone needs to be talking about this and trying to bring these things together. The establishment doesn't reward that kind of work, right? Whenever you publish in the top journals, you're usually very focused. When you get grant money, it's to look at very specific kinds of issues where you already kind of know how the problem is going to be solved. You end up, especially in the US institutions with grant funding, you kind of have to already have succeeded in your project in order to get the money. And so where's the risk and where's the interdisciplinarity when it's other people who are very specific and focused who are making the decisions about whether your grant gets funded or your paper gets published? So the system itself makes it very difficult to embrace these multi-scale kinds of approaches, as I think my approach is. I think sometimes this is the luxury of being a philosopher is I get to kind of, I get to dabble in these different areas, right? But I also thought, at least personally, if I want to explain or at least engage with the sciences of the things I'm interested in, like cognition or intelligence, I think I should have had some training to see what these scientists do. And so I have training in experimental psychology and in neuroscience, because I wanted to see kind of what the philosophers are saying. And if it makes any sense, I wanted to see what the neuroscientists are doing that the philosophers are right or wrong about. But it's been really hard to do. And not everyone wants to do that, nor should they. You end up getting more successful if you focus on a limited range of things and get really good at that. So yeah, I think interdisciplinarity, I think the way the system is set up, the reward in academia and things like that, I think that's definitely poses a challenge to providing a multidisciplinary, multi-scale account of very complicated phenomena.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why I asked you that question is that, perhaps I have a privileged position because I'm able to do this full time, and I get to talk with people from many, many different disciplines, mostly the psychological, behavioral, evolutionary sciences, but also from other areas. And I understand, it's perfectly understandable that people, of course, cannot learn all of these, and neither can I. I only know tiny bits of everything, let's say, but it's perfectly understandable. But on the other hand, sometimes I see a lot people from these different disciplines dealing with the same subjects, talking past each other just because they are not versed on what the other person is working on, the kinds of theoretical approaches they have, the kinds of methodologies they apply, concepts and so on. And sometimes it can become really frustrating to see that perhaps people are clinging so much to their own, I don't know, pet theories or pet methodologies or their own preferred frameworks, and and perhaps this is the part that frustrates me the most, just easily dismiss some other things or other approaches that other people have. And many times it's because they don't even have a good enough understanding of what the other people are coming from, because again, they don't have enough knowledge about it. I mean, I don't know if you agree with what I'm saying here, or if you have any criticisms of it. So.
No, I agree. And I'll take you one step further. And here's another hot take. I think a lot of scientists don't even really understand the commitments of their own discipline. And I say that as a matter of fact, not as a value judgment, because there is no need to question the commitments, right? So Thomas Kuhn, historian, philosopher of science, he talks about normal science. Normal science is when you have a community of people who speak the same language, right? So maybe they'll take a biologist. They kind of understand what a gene is, what a cell is. They have shared methods, basic statistical analysis. They all understand that. They all, read the same journals. They all teach the same textbooks, right? They all have an idea of what experiments should look like and what an answer should look like. And this is just normal, everyday kind of science. They don't have to question whether a gene really exists, or whether, what is a cell, or what, are these statistical methods sound? They don't have to. And they probably, as a discipline, be worse off if they paid attention to that. They can make a lot of progress by just accepting the paradigm, right? The problem, though, is when you start hitting, at least what Thomas Kuhn said, you start hitting anomalies, like, right, too many things that you can't explain, or when things get too messy, that's when scientists are questioning their paradigm. And so I totally understand and I totally respect the day-to-day scientist who doesn't have to question the foundation, and they don't have to pay attention to anybody else. But if you have that tendency, if you have that personality that questions things, it's very easy to find what people don't know about even their own discipline.
Okay, great. So perhaps this is a good point to wrap up the interview. And the book is, again, The Ecological Brain, Unifying the Sciences of Brain, Body, and Environment. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Favela, apart from the book, would you like to tell people again where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so you can find me. My website is a little bit, the link is a little bit long, but I'll ask Ricardo to post it. But it's Luis H. Favela, one word, .wixsite, wixsite.com/Luis H. Favela. If you go there, you can get links to my papers and see what's going on, what I'm up to. You can feel free to email me at luis.favela@ucf.edu. That's also on the website as well. But yeah, and you can pick up the book at any seller of books, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon. Yeah, glad to be here. Happy to talk about this stuff.
No, it's always a pleasure to have you on, Dr. Favela, and I really loved the book, so I really hope that people from the audience also buy it and read it. It's a very interesting read, and thank you so much again for coming on the show, and I really hope to have another chance of talking with you somewhere in the future. So
that'd be great. Thank you, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.